Okay, thanks, Ty. So I will call the special meeting of Thursday, May 18, 2023, of the Kent Planning and Zoning Commission to order at 7:01. I will start by welcoming Shelby Green, who is our newest regular member. Hello, Shelby. I will. I think now that we're recording, I will perform the roll call. That's me, Daryl and Wes and Karen and Shelby and Alice as regular members, and Chris as an alternate. And we're hoping that Annie will join us, but we'll move along until she gets here. Some housekeeping. This is a public meeting, which will be audio and video recorded, just like every other Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. To ensure sound quality, the default rule for this meeting is that everyone will remain on mute. Commissioners and staff will generally remain on mute except when speaking or voting, and will generally keep their video on throughout the meeting. Applicants and members of the public should feel free to leave their video on or off. However, they will be asked to turn their video on when speaking, and when speaking, applicants and members of the public will state their names for the record. I know we don't have any applications tonight. If we do take comments from the public tonight, we ask that you be respectful and speak first, or seek first to understand and then be understood, to listen carefully and don't interrupt, to stay on topic, to speak for yourself and not for someone else. It's okay to disagree, but remember this is a discussion, not a debate, and be candid, and please avoid making assumptions, particularly about the intentions, belief, or motives of others. And then with that behind us, I think we can roll into the business of the evening, which is the agenda item 3A, the review of proposed zoning regulation amendments and possible recommendations to public hearing. Glenn Shalder is here. He's our planning consultant from Planometrics, and welcome, Glenn.
Hi, everybody.
And Glenn, would you like to roll through the agenda bullets in 3A, or would you like me to lead and then you can
I think I guess I'd like to do kind of a modified approach to that, Matt. I put together the comments that we received at the April 20th meeting in terms of comments on different sections of the regulations. And that would actually lead us through those regulations one by one. But I think if we focus on the comments and the regulation, and then I think perhaps our goal on each one might be to indicate whether or not we feel we're ready to go to public hearing, and then get those scheduled for a future meeting.
That's great. So I will. I think that's a great idea. So why don't you start?
Happy to do that. So I think I put together this report for the commission, which is a summary of the comments on the possible zoning changes from the April 20th community input meeting. On the following pages, I break it down by the section of the regulations, and then I've identified things that I think a good comment was made, and I suggest the commission might consider making those changes. Certain situations perhaps where no changes recommended. And if there's things which I think were raised, but the commission hadn't discussed before, I noticed those for possible discussion in the future. So I think the first section of the regulations that we generally start talking about is parking and loading. I think there's some formatting issues. I'd suggest that's a change that we might want to make. The comment came from Kent Affordable Housing that the language about possible modifications to the parking ratios seemed to be prohibited for residential uses, and they suggested that that language be modified to allow that to happen. And so that's in section 8250. I've read this language again since we talked about it, and I think we could even just take out this language about anything for a single family residential use, and just if somebody wants to apply for a special permit to modify the parking standards, the commission, I think, has the information that they need to actually go ahead and make that change. There were no other comments on the parking and loading regulations. Does the commission want me to bring that regulation up so that we can kind of walk through it? Is that what you think might be a good next step, Matt? Or are we ready to move ahead with parking? What's the commission's pleasure on this one?
Well, let me say that that in my review, I used the compendium of possible amendments
Yep.
from our April 20th public meeting.
Yep.
So if everybody's got that together, it seems. Okay, so you've got it here. Okay, that's great.
Yeah, I do. I have them both up and yeah.
So let me ask whether whether there are any comments from the commission regarding this number 1, section 8250 formatting, where Glenn is suggesting that we make the change, and number 2, 8250, the allowing for parking modifications for residential uses.
So on the first one, the first comment, number 1 here is that you'll notice that this text here has bullets rather than letter designations like 1A or 1B. And I just think if the commission is going to refer to these in the future, letters are better than bullets. And so I just go ahead and make that change.
Agreed.
I think the second comment was the one from Kent Affordable Housing. And this says that up above, it says an applicant can request the commission reduce the minimum parking or minimum loading requirements. And the commission may do that by special permit. And then down below, it says, except for request to modify the parking requirements for residential use. I think Justin indicated that he felt that that might limit what Kent Affordable Housing might do in the future. And I think we could just get rid of this phrase and simply say the commission may consider the following factors in reviewing a request to modify the parking and loading requirements.
Sounds simpler.
Yep. So I think there were no other comments that came in on the parking regulations. I think we've updated these, as the commission recalls, to modify the parking standard and clean up some provisions related to possible consideration of on-street parking, getting rid of the phrase shopping center, which was in the sign regulations, is actually bundled in here as well. So I think this one may be ready to go to public hearing when the commission feels ready to do so.
I generally agree that both of those, I do agree that both of those changes make the proposed regulation better. We've talked about this several times. Ty, would you recommend that we make motions individually at this meeting?
Yeah, that probably would be best, just in case somewhere along the way, some of these you don't want to do, then we'll have a clear picture of what's going to public hearing and what's not. So the next regular meeting that would make it for a public hearing would be the July 13th. I don't know if you want to do it as a special meeting. The earliest you could do this is June 26th. We have to give the COG, their 35 days notice. We've got to get the public hearing notices out, clerk's information.
I would suggest that we put this on the agenda for the regular meeting, but be prepared to table it depending on how busy we will be.
Good idea.
Then just a bit of housekeeping, I should elevate an alternate member to voting status. So I'll recommend that we elevate Anne to voting status for the time that she's here. Hi, Anne. And then I would look for unless there's further discussion about the parking regulations and the proposed changes, I would look for a motion to recommend this for a public hearing.
So I'll make a motion to to have a public hearing on the amended parking regulations as reviewed tonight to the next regular meeting.
No,
Second,
no, you can't do the next regular meeting. That would be too soon. It has to be
Oh,
July
yeah,
13th.
I'm sorry, yes, the July meeting. Sorry.
I second for the July meeting.
Great. Any discussion?
If I might, Matt, just for the sake of clarification, what we've called in the compendium, we've also identified two other minor changes, which I hope Wes would agree are included in this motion. One of it is a change to section 3500 of let me bring it up on the screen. Bear with me for a second. So apologize. In our discussion of the regulations, we identified section 8200. In addition, at the end of this section was these two additional provisions. We noticed in the village mixed use overlay district that it had its own set of parking requirements, which was different than 8200. And so we just referred to section 8200 here. So that's a change in 3540. In addition, you may recall our conversation that we had this phrase shopping center. And we're recommending that the phraseology shopping center be removed from the regulation. And so that is also a change, which I hope would be included in this motion or perhaps a second motion, whatever the chair feels is appropriate.
So Glenn, is that the bulk of any changes in parking? that you-
Yeah, these I grouped under the umbrella of parking because they're both parking related issues.
All right, so I'll amend my my motion to include 3,500 and 8,100.
Thank you.
I'll second that amended motion.
Karen or Alice, any thoughts, any? Okay,
No, I think it looks good. I think
Looks
those,
good.
great. And Annie? And Chris, Annie, so I saw you sort of nodding your head and I was reading your lips that you just thought that everything was okay. Then I will call the vote. All those in favor, so signify by raising your hand and or saying aye. And that motion carries. Okay, thanks, everybody. And let's say, for discussion's sake, that when we're making motions on the changes that we're discussing in the consolidated, we're calling this the consolidated,
The compendium.
the document that we're reviewing tonight, that you prepared for our meeting tonight, is called the let me get there. The
I think
compendium is the one that we reviewed for the public informational meeting. And the document that we're looking today that's listed under 3A is,
This is the document, Matt?
that's the one.
Yep.
That's the compendium. And what's the other one that you're showing us, Glenn?
It's the summary of comments from the April 20th meeting. Let me just, I think this is in your application materials. It's the cover memo titled Comments and Possible Zoning Changes from the 420 Community Input Meeting.
So I'm trying to get to a point where the document that we reviewed at the 420 meeting, the information that was available to the public at the 420 meeting, coupled with the changes that we're reviewing tonight, should be incorporated into any motion going forward. right? So the document that we reviewed, that the public saw, plus the comments tonight should be the basis for the approval to go to public hearing.
Correct. Just for the commission's information, following the meeting tonight, I will update these regulations and deliver them to Ty for posting and distribution to the COG well in advance, and clearly indicate what Matt just stated. The foundation will be the compendium for the April 20th meeting as modified by the comments received in our discussion tonight on the comments that were received.
That's great. And the discussion tonight is based upon the comments for PZC 05/10/23 that
Yep.
were in our packet tonight. Okay, thanks. I just wanted to make sure that we're all, just so we didn't get sort of tripped up again by going back to the changes that we had made earlier in the compendium. Okay, so then we can move towards senior living.
Bear with me just for a moment here. I'll bring that up. So this provision here is two types of changes. The first of which is a change to section 2200 definitions. These are the definitions we had talked about for independent living, assisted living, and skilled nursing. And then in addition to that is modification to the use provisions in the regulations that these types of developments, whether they're individual or all three of these types of facilities are provided in one development, would be permitted by special permit in the VR1, the VR2, the rural district, the village center district, and the industrial district. Now, I do want to have a quick conversation with you about the industrial district. There were no comments that were received on this from the meeting in April. The issue I want to bring to the commission's attention is that under case law in Connecticut and state law, an affordable housing development cannot be proposed in an industrial district unless the industrial district also allows for housing in it. And so we don't have a lot of industrial land in Kent. And it's possible that right now the industrial zone that we do have is protected from an affordable housing development. It could not be proposed in the industrial district. If we were to make this change, it could be. So I might suggest for your consideration that we not do the change to 4324. If somebody comes along and wants to do an independent living, assisted living, or skilled nursing facility in the industrial district, they can make that pitch to the commission, and then we could either modify the zoning district or make some other modification. Just wanted to bring this to your attention in case there's any element or issue or concern there in terms of the limited amount of industrial land that we have.
Well, I think that's a good point. I'm just pulling up the current regulations now because we do have limited industrial, properties in the industrial district. And as Glenn said, we certainly have not allowed that in the past, not certainly in the affordable housing. So I'm just running through the regulations of the industrial district and what's permitted. I think Glenn may be right. I think that Glenn's idea is a good one. Does anybody else have any thoughts?
I'd go along with it. There's limited land, and it would be good that Kent had the ability to expand its industry without competition.
I agree with both Glenn and Wes on that.
Okay, Chris gave a thumbs up. Is there any other discussion before we maybe move towards a motion on the senior living change? Then I would look for a motion.
So this is only on the industrial part of it, the housing.
I think I would look for a motion to move the senior living changes to the regulations with the modification that it doesn't include the industrial district to a public hearing.
Okay, I couldn't say it better, so moved.
Second.
Great, thanks Wes and Daryl. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the vote. All those in favor, so signify by raising your hand and or saying aye. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's 7. And that motion carries. Then we can move into the reasonable accommodations.
Thank you, Matt. So this regulation, as you may recall from our conversation, allows some flexibility in the regulations when there are provisions of state or federal law that provide conflicting guidance. So for example, the classic case here is a scenario of somebody is entitled to handicapped accessibility to actually get into the house that they own, but the establishment of a ramp for a wheelchair, for example, might intrude into a yard setback. And so, and normally in a situation like that, we would say, well, I'm sorry, that's not permitted. You have to get a variance from the ZBA. But technically, the ZBA is supposed to grant a variance based on the hardship on the property, not the person. So reasonable accommodation is a concept where we now, because of this provision in federal law, are allowed to consider a reasonable accommodation. And the reasonable accommodation is, perhaps in that case, as long as you need the ramp, it can be in the yard setback. So at that point in time, we're off and running. The provisions here is that for this to be granted, it's requires some information, some documentation. First of all, that there is a provision of state or federal law that applies to this situation, that a departure from the requirements of the regulations is appropriate to address or accommodate that element of state or federal law. The departure that from the regulations which would be considered is no more than reasonable or necessary to address it. And then fourth, that reasonable strategies have been employed to mitigate any impacts to abutting properties. And for example, that could be maybe a buffer or some planting or some other accommodation. So I think that this could provide some relief in certain situations where state or federal law applies. And again, no comments on this at the April 20th informational meeting.
Any questions or comments from the commission?
Matt, this is Alice. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Glenn, is there any application or sensitivity to time that an exception or an accommodation is issued, or is the accommodation permanent?
I think
Maybe
that,
my,
no, I think Alice, that's an excellent question. I think this would be part of the evaluation that the commission would go through. I'm familiar with this situation in another town where somebody claimed that they needed a hot tub for recuperation from an injury. They actually got a doctor to recommend that, but the modification that they were requesting was to a side yard setback and to lot coverage. The commission went through that and decided that in that situation, that was not subject to this type of provision, even with the doctor's note. That was not necessary. There are ways that it could have been done and complied with the yard setbacks and other requirements. So I think I only tell that story to come back to my main suggestion or consideration for the commission, is I think these situations will always be somewhat specific in terms of the circumstances, of the individual or situation, the provision of state or federal law, and the configuration of the property. This language, Mike Ziska put together in another municipality. And so with his guidance, I've brought it to Kent for your consideration as well. But I think it's not a variance in that respect, but the commission would be considering this in that type of situation, evidence gathering and deciding what's reasonable and fair.
But to follow on with that, if the commission approved a reasonable accommodation for a handicap ramp, and then at some point in the future, that handicap ramp was not necessary, it wasn't a necessary accommodation anymore, does the approval stay with the property, or does the commission have the ability, once a property sells or once the person is no longer living there for whatever reason, to ask that handicap ramp be removed?
I think that as part of the application by the person, what are your intentions once there is no longer a need for the handicapped ramp? And I think that the applicants would likely state that they would remove it. I think the commission would be wise to accept that proposal and write that into the approval. If the applicant was a little coy about exactly what their intentions were, I think the commission could have a dialogue and say, I hope the applicant understands that this is a provision related to this handicap situation, so that should that situation no longer exist, the ramp would need to be removed. And then make that a condition of approval. I think that's certainly within your rights. And I think that's exactly the situation that this type of language is designed to address.
That's fair.
Matt, I wondered, I'm sorry, I wondered whether the special exception might be limited to access to the building for ingress and egress. That might avoid the hot tub scenario.
I think there's the challenge we have right now. I think, Shelby, is that specifically we've identified the Americans with Disabilities Act. It can also apply to other constitutional protections, be they free speech or equal protection, et cetera. So it's hard for us to anticipate different ways that this might play out in the future, and particularly if there's additional federal rights granted. So I think this language is meant to set up a scenario that we can grant relief without having to show a physical hardship based on the property configuration. So I think I would suggest for the commission's consideration to leave it a little open-ended, because you get all the tools here to go through this process of evaluation and say yay or nay in terms of whether it makes sense in this circumstance. So I would urge you to leave it a little broader for that purpose.
Any other comments or concerns or questions before we move to maybe a motion to move this to public hearing? Then I would look for a motion to that effect.
So I'll move that we move reasonable accommodations under the same guidelines to public hearing in July.
I'll second the motion.
Thanks, Wes and Karen. Any further discussion? Then hearing none, I'll call the vote. All those in favor, so signify by raising your hand and or saying aye. And that motion carries. Okay. Thank you all. And then Glenn, moving on to the camps and special events.
So this topic got some discussion at the meeting on April 20th. As you may recall, there were some specific questions from the owner operator of Club Getaway in terms of how different sections might be interpreted. I attempted to respond based on how I felt the regulation was crafted and what it stated. So I think the commission listened to that discussion. I didn't write them all down here, but I generally got the sense that the operator of Club Getaway was reasonably comfortable with the proposals and the responses that were given. So my sense, I think, is that the commission, I think, could or should feel comfortable moving towards public hearing. And if there are issues or problems that come up and we hear about those at the public hearing, we can remove or modify the regulation or withdraw the application to ourselves, et cetera. From the comments, there were several things that came up. So I'm going to refer to my list, but rather than flipping back and forth, Matt, between the documents, I think what I'll do is go to the specific language that was questioned, and then we can talk that through. So the
Great.
first section was to 6632. And the language talks about youth camp, but at the end here, it says camp resort. And you may recall in the definition section, what we said was a youth camp is for a traditional summer camp for youth 18 years and older, and a camp resort is for adults or not. It's not a youth camp, it's something else. This provision here mirrors the current regulations and actually mirrors state law, which requires that there be registration of campers and other things like that for a youth camp, but not for a camp resort. So my error when I included camp resort here, I muddied the waters. I think the owner operator of Club Getaway was correct. This language should not be here. And so this is the first suggestion, if you will, to remove that language here from 6630. I'm just going to continue on. So if anybody has any questions or thoughts, please jump in. The next comment had to do with 5C. And this had to do with the question here. What it says is that mini bikes, motorcycles, snowmobiles, all-terrain vehicles, motorboats, general and outside public address systems shall not be operated on the premises except in emergencies declared by the town, in emergency situations involving life of property, or unless approved by the commission by special permit. And what by this, the question was asked, well, is that a separate special permit? And I think my response at that time was that this is the special permit that is required in section 6620 for the master plan of improvements. In other words, you declare up front what you're going to do, and then the commission reviews and approves that. And if you say, well, listen, I've got a lake and I want to have motorboats on the lake. How many might you have? What type of noise generation? The commission could say that's fine. But then we're not doing unmuffled speedboat races because we said something else. So I just think the language here is to clarify by special permit as part of section 6620. We're just going to add that language in here as part of 6620. I think there was a question about what if there were existing campsites at for example, the Club Getaway property, there were already within 100 feet of a lake or river. And I think those will be declared as part of the special permit under 6620. And I think we add language in here to say the same thing, either unless pre-existing or authorized under section 6620. If anything is proposed that doesn't exist today and is proposed within 100 feet, it's going to require a wetland permit. So there's going to be multiple sets of eyes on that. But the situation here is to provide some protection for that. I think the last comment had to do with section 6640. And this is the provision about what it takes to get a special permit from the commission for special events. And then right here, management plan shall be submitted by the applicant, and it says identifying should be put before the colon and delete it in the first bullet, and delete the word outlining here in the fourth bullet. So in other words, we'll say submitted by the applicant identifying 1, different categories of special events, 2, the requested number, 3, the requested duration, and 4, how the camp resort will address water supply. So it's just creating parallelism in the language here on this particular section. So those were the changes and the comments, if you will, that came up. There really weren't any additional comments from persons other than the owner operator of Club Getaway. So if the commission's comfortable, I think we could make these changes and also move to public hearing in July.
So Glenn, in accordance or somewhat in conformity with the discussion we had earlier with regard to bullet points and numbers.
Yep.
Is there a metric elsewhere in the regulations where we have a subset of, in this case, 2A with the 2 bullet points? Or
Yeah, that's a
2B
good
with
point,
4
Matt.
bullet points?
Yeah. So you may recall back earlier that the subsets that were available in some other language was the, I guess they're the lowercase Roman numerals. So I think it would make sense within this section to do that, so the commission could refer to a specific line item rather than second bullet or something else like that. Nice catch, Matt. Thank you.
Excuse me, Matt.
Yes.
Jean Speck has raised her hand. She's an ex officio member, so although this isn't a public hearing, you might want to entertain whatever it is that she has to say.
Of course. She fell off of the top of my screen. So if she jumps back on, then I don't.
She's still there, but her hand is down now, so maybe she changed her mind.
Down there. Okay. Ms. Beck, as our ex officio, I'll just keep an eye out for your hand. Any other or any questions or comments from the commission?
Is the commission comfortable with this approach? I
Entire time that I
think it
was
addresses
saying
many
that.
of the issues that have arisen
Can
with
you all hear
regard.
me okay?
Oh, there we go. Hi,
We can
Jean.
just hear you now, Jean. Yes.
Sorry about that. I was on mute and my computer was on mute. Under C, I just wanted to mention that the commission might want to consider adding emergency management to that bulleted list because of that Title 28 for special events where they go over, I think it's 12 or 24 hours. Emergency management has to get involved, and the organization has to submit an action plan to emergency management. I can shoot over the statute if you need me to.
I don't think you need to, Gene. I mean, I think Matt and members of the commission, I think the language here is that to give the commission the opportunity to seek comments from a variety of agencies. We list any other entity or organization, which may include, not limited to. But I think the issues, again, if it was to be a significant event of some type, which as Gene indicates, might be multiple days, we can seek comment, and we can certainly add emergency management in here if the commission wishes. We can consider those as part of the permit process, or maybe the response that comes back is no comment or whatever. So it's up to the commission here.
So Jean, if I may, what is the relationship of the Emergency Management Department to the town? Are they a subset of the Board of Selectmen, or are they their own? And they don't have their own budget line, so they're probably not a department. Is that correct?
Yeah, they do have their own budget line. So while they're not paid employees that have a chair in the building, they're in the budget, and by statute, they're part of the town government.
Hey, Matt, another option for the commission's consideration is to just list emergency management in the final bullet. Any other entity or organization which may include, not limited to, emergency management, water pollution control authority, Aquarian water, et cetera.
I think that's a reasonable approach if the balance of the commission is amenable to that inclusion.
Sounds good.
I think it's a good idea to include it.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Thanks, Karen. So any other thoughts? And you know, I know that we accepted the comments of for selectmen as an ex officio member. But never mind. That's enough of that thought. That's probably not germane. So if there are no more comments or questions or concerns to be raised by the balance of the commission, then I might look for a motion to move forward to the public hearing, the changes from the compendium and the changes that we discussed tonight.
So Ty, have you recorded all of those comments? If we would make a motion to include all those amendments that were discussed here?
Yep. Between Glenn and myself and Donna, we'll capture everything.
Okay, so I'll make that motion that we move camps and special events to public hearing in July.
Second.
Great. Thank you, Wes. That's some heavy lifting for tonight. And thanks, Daryl. Any other comments or concerns or questions? Then hearing none, I'll call the vote. All those in favor, so signify by raising your hand and or saying aye. And that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Thanks, everybody. And Wes, we should be sure to tell Adam that he can't miss any more meetings.
Yeah.
Making those motions. All right, so let's move on to accessory dwellings.
So you may recall there was some discussion with regard to accessory dwelling units. We've reconfigured the table here to clarify the various provisions. Again, in the VR zones, if you have a single family dwelling, you can get a first ADU within or attached or detached, and then also a second ADU. You can't have two detached ADUs, but you can have one within and one detached. And in addition to that, you can also have a detached guest house. Again, for a two-family dwelling, you can also have an ADU, and that requires a special permit. And also there's a detached guest house, which is allowed there. And the same scenario in the RU1 district. This is a little bit different in the sense that a guest house, a detached guest house is a zoning permit, whereas a detached ADU is a special permit. The big difference between a guest house and an accessory dwelling unit is the guest house does not have a kitchen in it. So it's meant to be served, if you will, by the main dwelling, but it might be detached for weekend guests or for, people sort of staying overnight, but would perhaps, have, again, their meals in the main house. So that's the scenario which has been created here. The comments that came in as part of the April meeting was whether someone could do an attached ADU and a detached guest house in the RU district. And I believe the answer to this is yes, based on the way this table is configured. In the RU1 district, accessory to a single family dwelling, you can get one ADU within or attached by zoning permit or detached by special permit. And then you could also do a detached guest house in lieu of the detached accessory dwelling unit by zoning permit. So you could have the house, ADU within or attached, and then a detached guest house in the ADU. I just want to make sure that's what the commission wishes and desires, and the regulation hopefully reflects that. And then on the following page was the question or issue about a deed restricted accessory dwelling unit. So I'm just going to jump ahead for a moment. These are the provisions that Kent has at the present time today. Owner shall reside in the premises. If the owner doesn't reside in the premises, it's a violation of the regulations and subject to penalties. We tied the parking into section 8200. Rather than requiring 2 off-street parking spaces for an accessory dwelling unit, it depends on whether it's a studio or a 1-bedroom, et cetera, and the parking is determined to be that way. The provision about limiting it to only 1 accessory apartment or guest house is eliminated because we are in fact going to allow that. And there are several situations here where one of the dwelling units has to be deed restricted as an affordable unit. And this now starts to get us into sort of the management issues as to how that might work and what the period of time might be. So I think this is an area where the commission could provide some input here on this regulation, or maybe this one would need some additional thought over time before we actually go ahead and schedule this one for public hearing. It's for the commission to talk about how you'd like to address this issue.
It seems to me to be quite complicated in its implication.
So I think the conversation we had that unfolded was, do we want to allow the possibility of 2 accessory dwelling units at a property? And as part of that discussion, the concept came up, well, if one of them is deed restricted as affordable, then that would be perhaps a motivation or reason for allowing for 2 of them. And then what now occurs as part of that conversation is, well, how long is the deed restriction for? And how are we going to manage that or enforce it over time or see what happens with regard to that occupancy? And that is, I think, where it starts to get a little bit more complicated, Wes, in terms of the provisions.
Right.
Matt, is there, or whoever, Glenn, is there like a number of deed restrictions? I mean, if you went through every deed in this town, how many of them would be restricted?
Well, I think, bear with me just for a moment here. So according to the state database, Kent has 0 deed restricted units today, deed restricted affordable units. So Alice, as you know, in that short period of time, I haven't read all of the deeds in town.
Right.
But the provision here And the way that that phrase is used is that a unit is deed restricted to sell at an affordable price for a certain period of time.
Right.
So generally speaking, this would be a relatively newer provision that
Mhm.
would apply.
Mhm.
And we would be aware of that.
Mhm.
These units would apply to the town's 10%
Mhm.
threshold, if you will.
Mhm.
So in that sense, there are some advantages to the town by having sort of more units. And for them to count, there has to be at least a period of 10 years. It would be deed restricted for 10, and it could be longer. Some communities and some parts of the statute talk about a deed restriction of 40 years. This is an accessory unit, not a principal unit. And so, again, we start to get into the issue of enforcement of that particular provision.
May I speak? I have sent before to the commission an example of a deed restriction which covers both who is going to manage and who is going to certify the tenants as having income suitable for affordable housing. As far as I know, the only units in town that are restricted are those at Templeton, South Common, and Stewart Farm. There used to be some that said that the house would never be sold to anybody of the Jewish religion, but I think those have all been removed.
With regard to the deed and the deed restriction, I was just trying to find in the village housing overlay district what the provisions for the longevity or the term of the restriction is. So I'd like to find a way to make those the length of the restriction conform with the balance of the regulations. Is that something that we could do?
I think the commission can establish a period that it thinks is reasonable. I did check with the state and the minimum is 10 for an accessory dwelling unit for it to count. So I started there. And the commission can extend that period. The commission can also require automatic renewal for successive 10-year periods unless the commission and the owner come up with an alternative approach, which is acceptable to both. If the term period is 10 years, after 10 years, the accessory dwelling unit remains, but it's not deed restricted as to price. So I think your options for just consideration could be 10 years, which automatically renews unless the commission releases it, or 40 years. Or some other term beyond 10. I mean, 40 is, I think, what you're looking for, Matt, in the mixed use overlay, et cetera. That was written under the incentive housing zone provisions, and that language was 40 years. Virginia, I've looked through my materials here, and I do have material that a one-page summary that you had put together showing specific changes to the regulations, but I didn't receive anything related to the enforcement or management of the unit itself. So I haven't seen that.
Well, I did send it to Ty, but maybe it didn't get into the materials for the meeting. But I can certainly send it again. It's a sample draft of a deed restriction that would be applied to such units. It's modeled on the affordable housing deed restrictions at South Common and various ones in other towns. And it addresses who will check out the people coming in, who will certify their incomes. That is a procedure which is done routinely at affordable housing complexes. And I have spoken to the current management of South Common and Stewart Farm within this week or two. And the manager there says perfectly simple for us to certify people and to come back and check them every year, because we do that with all of our affordable tenants now.
So what I'd like to suggest, Matt, the other members of the commission, I think that piece of information, again, I'm looking through my file here and I can't put my fingers on it. I don't recall having seen it. I'd like to get that. And I think that what Virginia suggested could be very helpful information to round out this regulation with regard to these issues of the term and then also management. So maybe this regulation here might not be quite ready for the July date, but might get it quickly and we could turn it around and the commission could address this at a June meeting and possibly then fit it on the agenda for July. I'm not quite sure.
I'd like to point out that I made an application to P&Z for this approval of this, my particular ADU in June 1 year ago. And it would be very nice to have it done by July of this year.
Not an application, though. That was a preliminary, that was you brought that.
Oh, it was a informal
Right,
presentation.
great. Yeah.
And
so-
because it immediately became obvious that all of the regulations were going to be changed so that my application could not be taken up until March of this year, when this process started, and now this process is running through July. At least.
So I would make a motion that, that we table the accessory dwellings until such time we have the information, but the time to properly review this section.
I think, Wes, if I could just jump in for a second, I know Virginia has been working hard on this, and I think the commission has understood her request and crafted a regulation here which addresses many of them. If I didn't get the information or I dropped the ball along the way, I want to apologize. I'll get onto this quickly. And my goal will be to have information back to you on a timely basis so that this can be processed. The commission can make whatever decisions it wishes, but you'll have the information before you as quickly as I can get it to you.
Okay, it's not just Virginia's suggestion. This is a very complex section that I personally have a lot of red flags here.
Yep, understood.
I confess, I do not know of a number of other people expecting to do this with deed restrictions. It's only that I care about affordable housing enough, and I have a nice space that could give somebody a home. Now, dealing with all the other possibilities, I can't help you.
Okay, so there's a motion on the table to table this discussion until a future meeting to be determined. And I would look for a second before we continue the discussion.
Second.
Thanks, Wes. Thanks, Daryl. So I'm not sure what the document that we're going to receive from Virginia says, and I don't want an explanation of it now. But I would say that for me, that the 10 years is which I would lean towards having it auto renew or renew unless released as a point of discussion for the next time we review this.
You want that in admitted, you want that to be revised in the motion?
No, no, I don't think so, Wes. That's just
Okay,
point of
right.
discussion,
Okay, good.
as part of the closing of the motion.
And if I may, Matt, I think your guidance is helpful to me. I can craft it that way. I think as Wes indicated, that the information that I get will get back to you as quickly as I can. The commission can now look at that arrangement and determine whether or not that's acceptable, or as Wes points out, still complicated. But I'll get to this as quickly as I can.
All right. Thank you, Glenn. And we appreciate all the work you're doing. Then any further discussion before we call the vote? Then I will do that. All those in favor, so signify by raising your hand and or saying aye.
Aye.
And that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, thanks, everybody. And then we will begin the discussion about the conservation development. I will start this conversation by saying that we're an hour in. Annie, let us know when you have to go. And I would suggest that we keep this discussion, limit this discussion to an hour. And then try to wrap this meeting up by 9 o'clock. We don't have to take all that time if we don't think we need it, but let's put a hard stop at 9. And with that, Glenn, you came up with an idea between the last time we met and now to sort of combine the
I
residential
did.
district and the rural zone. So why don't I let you talk?
All right, so let me set the stage here a little bit. The vast majority of comments we got at the April meeting were really about the conservation development regulations. And we have a situation in the regulations today which really have sort of two different flavors of conservation development: what happens in the village district, what happens in the rural district. And realistically, there's also provisions elsewhere in the regulations that refer to those. So honest to God, there's 4 different regulations with different provisions in them, all related to the concept of conservation. I was trying to honor the structure of the regulations that the commission has had for some time, and it just kept getting more and more complicated to try to get it all consistent. And then I guess I had maybe a little bit of an epiphany, and I said, why are we doing this way?
Good question.
Why don't we just say, listen, we like conservation developments, we would like to encourage them, but we want to have a consistent set of standards. So rather than 40% open space in one and 50% in the other, and these types of provisions, why don't we try to get to one regulation that kind of addresses this issue? So I said, let me spend a little bit of time going through the regulations to see whether or not it's possible. And I came up with an approach which I think can work for us. And so I've shared that information with the commission. I'm prepared to put it up on the screen. And I think what it does is address many of the comments, et cetera, that were received as part of the public meeting, and might provide a pathway forward for us. I don't want you to think that this is done or it's a done deal. I think I think the idea here is that I think this could be a way forward for us to create a consistent framework for how we might address the whole question about conservation development in both the VR and the RU1 district. So what I'd like to do is just kind of walk through these pages, and then we can come back and go through it in a little bit more detail. And I don't think we should necessarily feel a rush to adopt this in July, and unless you're comfortable with it and feel that we've addressed sort of the major issues here. So first of all, the village residential district, conservation developments are already identified there based on what the commission had done before. We're going to take advantage of section 6600. And we're going to just clarify that it's a parcel of land of 10 acres or more, or a subdivision resulting in 5 lots or more, that the commission and a property owner or developer would apply for that, and the commission would decide whether or not to grant it in the village residential district based on the quality of the design, the information that comes together. In the rural residential district, it wasn't as clear as we might want it to be. We did have this conservation development overlay district, which basically required conservation development in the RU1, but it wasn't clearly spelled out. So what I'm suggesting here is we do two things in the rural residential district. Was right at the very top as part of the purpose and intent. We put in this box and says refer to section 3225, provisions requiring a conservation development for subdivision of land in the RU1 unless it's less than 20 acres, results in 4 lots or fewer, the commission doesn't feel like it's the preferred approach. And then this new section 3225 would get added in, and this says required as part of subdivision approval. This is the commission with the public hearing, and that is conservation development. So as a result of this approach, we no longer need section 5200, which is the conservation development overlay zone, because we're putting it right here, saying it's required, and the provisions that were in 5200 are all going to get merged into the new conservation development regulation. So I think this sets the framework up to say it's required in the rural district and it's provable by special permit in the village district in application to the commission. So then I set up section 6700. This will become the new framework, if you will, for conservation development. We say when land is to be developed for residential uses in Kent, conservation development patterns are preferred. We've identified the purposes that we had before, edited them a little bit in terms of the language, the wording, et cetera. And also indicated to accomplish these purposes, the conservation development can be required in the RU1 district and may be allowed in the VR district. In terms of the overall design of development, you may recall under the current regulations, we had this distinction between primary and secondary conservation areas. The original approach was to identify the sort of the most significant resources where development could not be located, and then other resources, which we called secondary conservation areas, that we would want to configure the development to protect these resources. The suggestion that came up as part of the POCD is to get rid of this distinction. All these resources should be important considerations as part of a conservation and development. So they've all been listed here for consideration as part of a conservation development approach. The requirement is that an applicant has to submit this sort of organic planning document or map or vision, if you will, that this is where the resources are located on this property. And this is how we can respect those resources most and best. And the commission would consider that as part of its review of the conservation development approach. If the commission doesn't feel that a thorough or thoughtful analysis has been done, if somebody's paying lip service to this approach and has ignored it, the commission can hire a landscape architect, engineer, or surveyor to do the analysis and charge the applicant for it to make sure that we are properly considering these resources on the property. So within the conservation development, the purpose of this analysis is to guide the location of open space areas, the preservation of such areas, the designation of conservation areas, this could be conservation easements, and also the configuration of development sites. So we're intending on using this natural resource information as a guideline, if you will, for the development overall. We can refer this plan or any plan to anybody to get their thoughts and comments going forward. Now, in terms of the preservation of open space, again, by merging the two sections together, the current regulations have the open space provision at 40% in the VR1, VR2, and 50% in the RU1. And we can modify that if the commission feels it's important to do so. I think there has been some discussion we've had in the past that the VR zone is actually a place where we might want to encourage some development. So perhaps a little bit less in terms of open space may not be appropriate, and perhaps not. I think this is significant. Number 2 here, I added a proportionality requirement. Now what this means, we had conversations as part of our earlier work where we had said that the commission is just going to get the wetlands and open space, water courses and floodplains and steep slopes as open space anyway, because you can't build on it. And I think the idea here is that in the configuration of the open space has to mirror the configuration of the property as a whole. So if 33% of the property is wetlands, water courses, steep slopes, or floodplain, then no more than 33% of the open space can be wetlands, water courses, steep slopes, and floodplains. So the remainder of the open space that you give to the town as part of this conservation development would end up being non-wetland, water course, steep slopes, or floodplain. So I've termed it here a proportionality requirement so that, again, the configuration of the open space is reflective of the parcel as a whole. I left in the language that says the commission may by special permit reduce the percentage of open space. I realize this is an issue which the commission has talked about, and we may want to delete this or we may want to leave this in. But I said, listen, perhaps one of the reasons that we might want to consider reduction in the percentage of open space is for the provision of affordable housing units. So whether it's in the village or elsewhere, the issue is maybe we would go from 40% to 30% of open space or 50% to 40% if in fact meaningful affordable housing could result. So it shouldn't just be an escape clause, if you will, for every developer to ask for, but the issue is perhaps there could be different types of community amenities that might occur as part of this. And I think this is something that might need some additional discussion. And we've carried forward the language here that the open space can be deeded to the land trust, the town of Kent, or a homeowners association if it's acceptable to the commission. So then I get to the provision here, which is really sort of the key question the developers are wanting to know, which is, well, how many lots can I get from this approach? And so this section here says, all right, look, in the village residential districts, you are going to use the minimum lot size approach. And this is where applicants would evaluate the property and its characteristics based on the lot sizes, which are the basic lot sizes in the VR district. So if you could only get 10 lots, you can't use a conservation and development approach, even with percent of open space, to get 12 lots. You may recall that the development or the regulation for the VR zone reduced the minimum lot size from 10 to 5 and from 30 to 15. No. Yeah, this is an approach which we want to use to preserve open space, but we also want to think about sort of the development that would result from that. And so you would go through this minimum lot size approach to figure out what the yield of the property could be, and then you're allowed to lay them out at 5,000 or 15,000 square foot lots. Then in the RU1 district, we always had this approach which said, you know, you take a look at all of the soil types on the property, multiply those or divide those by the density factor for the zone, for the soil class, if you will. And so if you had 40 acres of property and all of it was, or excuse me, a third of it was class 1, a third of it was class 2, et cetera, you would multiply that or divide that by the minimum lot size, and that would tell you how many lots you can have max. And that's the same approach that we're talking here, that you would do that math based on the soil types on the property to get the maximum number of lots. And if you want to go ahead and spend the money, you can go out and do soil testing and convince us, not based on the soils map, that maybe the soil types are different here. So 2 different approaches. For the village, it's based on the lot size because that basically has water and sewer. And then the other one in the rural district is based on the soil types. You may recall, I think it was Yos who mentioned it. We had this provision in section 4 here, which talked about planned unit developments, and we should either define it I think a planned unit development is probably an unusual approach for Kent. We'd probably either do a subdivision of lots or a common interest ownership community. And so I think we can just identify those two designations. And then I think at this point in time, we get into the development standards for the individual lots. And so this is the sizes that the lots would be, and this takes the table, which is in the regulations, and blends them together. I'm suggesting for your consideration that we add a minimum square requirement in the VR1 district. And I think, as you may recall, we had some testimony or input at the community meeting that talked about a setback around the perimeter of the development so that, you know, somebody's side yard or rear yard wasn't right next to an abutter, but there'd be a slightly different setback around the perimeter of the development, but perhaps a smaller setback within. And then we're missing some provisions related to building height. So I just added some provisions in there. I think the last page is the road and drainage standards. The provisions for these, slight differences in terms of the provision of roadways and whether an existing farm lane or farm road could be used to service the lots. And I think I'd like to have a conversation with you about roads being constructed to town specifications and requirements to the greatest extent practical. I think that's a phrase which really doesn't provide a lot of guidance to the commission or to an applicant. Either it's in accordance with town standards or it's not. But I think, you know, or maybe we say it's in accordance with town standards unless modified by the commission or something else like that. So I think this brings everything together. I think it simplifies the overall approach to conservation development in the regulations. And I think the key elements here relate to the things we've been talking about the most, which is the percentage of open space, the configuration of the open space in terms of buildable and unbuildable land, and then how we would determine what's a reasonable density. So I felt after working on this, that this was a great step forward in terms of setting up a framework that we can now work with and recognize that we're treating conservation development similarly, whether they're in the village residential or the rural district. And I look forward to your input and feedback.
So I'd like to make a suggestion that that Ty send this to us so that we can all review it in detail.
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. I thought that had happened. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Wes. I was kind of going through it quickly.
No, but then take it up at the next meeting.
I'm good with that. I think there's some big pictures in here, and I appreciate the opportunity to give the commission members an overview, but I want to make sure that we're comfortable with what is suggested here, and that we feel the regulations are a good step forward for Kent.
Glenn, I just have a question about whether the open space minimum amounts, the 40% and 50% are sort of standard among comparable towns in the state. And were they set in response in relation to pressures for development in Kent or the need for development in Kent?
That's a great question, I think, Shelby. So many communities around the state, if somebody comes in for a subdivision development in Kent, the regulations today say that 15% of the property shall be set aside as open space. And what a conservation subdivision does is it allows the developer to site roughly the same number of houses on smaller parcels so that more of the parcel area could be set aside as protected open space. 50% is not an uncommon number. Every community can have a different number, but I think these provisions here is not uncommon. And I know certainly since the adoption of the zoning regs, I think it was in the recent update in 2016 or so. Listen to that, to call it recent is what, 7 or 8 years ago, right? Time flies when you're having planning and zoning fun. But I think the 50% standard has been there. So again, it reflects a little bit of a trade-off. In a conventional subdivision, it might be 15% open space and the rest of the land is carved up into larger lots. In a conservation development, you would have perhaps the same number of lots, but they're allowed to be smaller. And more open space is set aside, which could be owned by the land trust or the town, et cetera, and be an amenity available to more people and protect more resources.
Thanks.
Thank
So
you.
Glenn, you're suggesting that, conservation development in the VR and conservation development in the RU be combined into a single section?
I think, so my sense, Wes, from looking through the regulations, comparing the provisions side by side, is that the concept I just sort of went through with Shelby is the same for both.
Right.
What we'd like to do is preserve more open space. We provide quite a bit more flexibility for how these lots or configurations might be laid out. And so there can be significant advantages for the community. And so how we would treat a conservation development in each of these districts is we're going to do the same environmental analysis. We're going to use that to preserve open space or site development. And then the approach for the dimensional standards and the number of lots would differ a little bit between them. But I think we would get used to one approach for conservation development, slightly different standards. And then I think it becomes easier for the commission to manage going forward as we explain this to people and they become familiar with it.
So I've always believed that less is more.
I think what I felt pleased about, Wes, when I had finished sort of looking this through is that I had been struggling with the 4 sections in the existing regulations. The VR district pointed to section 6700. And then we had the RU1 district, and then we also had this section, which was the conservation development overlay. So there were 4 different provisions. And I think what we're able to do now is get the meat of the issue here into 6700. The other zones refer to it. And I think as long as we get the language which reflects the commission's desires, I think it does help us quite a bit.
Great.
I agree. I think consolidating the information is really helpful. Glenn, as we move forward into the subdivision regulation review and rewrite, do you envision somewhat mirroring the language that we land on here in the subdivision regulation, or were you thinking about maybe pointing in the subdivision regulations to this section of the regulations?
Yeah, I think this is kind of an esoteric area of planning and zoning, but subdivision regulations are in the planning section of the statutes. The basic intent of a set of subdivision regulations is the commission is acting as a consumer protection agency. When somebody comes in for a subdivision, you are saying, yes, this is a buildable piece of land. It has the capacity to support a well and a septic system in compliance with the health code, that whoever buys this lot now or in the future can be assured that this lot is buildable. It's not like, the old joke about land in Florida or, the Okefenokee Swamp or anything else like that. So the subdivision is really about the buildability of the lot. The preservation of open space in the parcel as a whole is certainly part of that, but that's the key issue. Zoning, on the other hand, is really the use of the property. And I think what we're saying here is that residential use is permitted. We prefer a conservation development approach. And so, Matt, in answer to your question, I think that you do have a conservation development or an open space subdivision section in the current subdivision regulations. And I think my suggestion would be that that gets eliminated and we refer back to the zoning regs, so that the open space standards, the yard setbacks, whether the road is public or private, is set up in the zoning. Subdivisions are required to comply with the zoning standards for the community. And so the standards are here, the process is over there in terms of how that would be approved. So I think that they travel together kind of hand in hand.
All right.
Now, you
thanks.
could have a conservation development, which is a common interest ownership community. That would be perhaps one approval with the zoning component of the Planning and Zoning Commission. As somebody says, oh no, I want to do subdivided lots, that would require perhaps a zoning approval plus a subdivision approval, because they're really kind of different functions. So our goal here, Matt, is to coordinate both sets of regs going forward. And I think this will help us do that.
So I do have a couple of questions, so that it can help frame my thoughts. With regard to section 67, or the proposed section 6720, the site inventory is required, professional, I'll call it, site inventory is required. Is that somewhat in line with what we're doing now, that every conservation subdivision requires a professional to do an analysis?
Yeah, I think we call out here a landscape architect, civil engineer, or surveyor licensed to practice in Connecticut. So according to state law, that they have the professional expertise to do this. And the thought and the hope, the desire is that they will do a thoughtful analysis of not just where did these resources exist. I mean, that's almost a sort of a surveying exercise, but what does it mean about the parcel? Which areas are really sort of the most sensitive and most important, and to use that as a guide for the location of open space and the conservation of the parcel. So I think that's the goal and intent here, is the commission gets a thoughtful analysis of the property. They understand it from an environmental, ecological perspective, and then uses that as part of its review and approval of the development. So I think it's an important first step here, Matt, rather than just being presented with an engineering drawing for a conventional subdivision, for example. This, my hope is a thoughtful evaluation of the property and its opportunities and constraints.
Yeah, so that last comment that you made gets to I guess my trepidation regarding the requirement for a professional analysis for a conservation subdivision in the village center residential, in the VR1 and VR2, where the conservation subdivision may be allowed, where it might be easier simply for the applicant to come forward with a standard subdivision and not bother to go through the conservation subdivision because it's more stringent.
Yeah, so it does say at the top, unless not required by the commission. So I think that the situation could be that somebody could come to you as part of the pre-application review, which is strongly recommended or encouraged, and say, I think this parcel, we don't need this analysis because things are pretty straightforward or clear. And the commission may agree with that or may not. So I think the idea here is that most of these areas, certainly the top 5, water courses, wetlands, vernal pools, steep slopes, and floodplain, are pretty much going to be required as part of the surveying because it ties into other regulatory requirements. The issues about farm fields and structures and town character areas, natural diversity database, core forests, et cetera, are important things to know as part of the analysis. Again, in the original regulations, we had broken them up as primary and secondary. But I think this just says, excuse me, identify where these places are on the parcel as a whole. Is it the requirement for professional analysis, Matt, that is concerning, or just the extent of the evaluation as a whole? What's your thought?
No, only that I'm just trying to understand what maybe an applicant might consider as being a hindrance to looking at a conservation development in the VR1 and 2, as opposed to just going with a conventional subdivision. So it was just a question. I don't have any as of yet, opinions one way or the other. I'm
Yep.
sure that I will, but no, I just,
There's not a lot of land left in the VR1, VR2. So I think whether or not it's going to show up significantly in the future. And if we got more small streets, if you will, like Lane and Elizabeth, those streets really do also add to the character of the village area in Kent. So I think they're reasonable choices sort of either way. But my sense would be that we should relate the development to the capacity of the land, the availability of water and sewer, the prevailing lot sizes, et cetera. But if we're going to increase density, perhaps that should be, along with affordable housing set-asides or sort of other things, like that. So I think it's another flavor which developers can consider.
all right, thanks. That's a thorough answer. Anybody else have any comments or questions?
So I think as a practical matter, Matt, that anyone doing a subdivision would seek professional help in some capacity before going forward with this. I don't see that would preclude anything. I mean, they're going to get a surveyor for sure.
Right. Okay.
And they're going to need an engineer for drainage, et cetera.
So I have just a couple of questions that I'd like to ask quickly, but I don't want to monopolize everybody's time. And I know we're down to our last 28 minutes.
I just had a quick question about the proportionality. If I'm understanding that correctly, if someone was proposing a conservation subdivision in the VR1 or 2, 40% of the parcel was steep slopes, wetlands and whatnot, they would only be able to propose 40% of the 40% preserved open space could be of the same nature. And I like that idea. Has that been used in other towns to keep the open space from being solely unbuildable land?
Communities differ on this. Yes, it has been used in other municipalities. I think the idea here is just as the commission had discussed this idea about, well, we're only going to get the unbuildable land as part of open space. There are some people who feel that unbuildable land is the most sensitive areas and that should be preserved as open space. And some other people say, well, hang on a sec, why can't we also get usable land as part of it? So there can be variations on the proportionality requirement by saying, different percentages or something else like that. I just went for discussion purposes, because I think that's the stage we're at right now, a straight proportionality requirement. It may have been Alice who brought it up, is this concept to make sure that we get open space that's not just the unbuildable land. So this was to expose the commission to this concept, and then we can refine it as we go.
I guess the other side of the question is, have you seen anything like this push development into more peripheral areas that maybe it shouldn't, in order to set aside some buildable land as open space?
Well, so the vast majority of land in Kent is in the RU1 district. The RU1 district requires a conservation development approach. So this is a new provision here, which wasn't in place before. And so is it going to have implications for development in the RU1? I would say yes, it will. How significant is that? Our lot sizes based on the soil types do provide quite a bit of flexibility. So our lot sizes today are 2, 3, 5 acre minimum lot sizes. And the conservation development allows the lot to actually be as small as 1 acre. So we're offering quite a bit of flexibility in the configuration of the subdivision. In addition to the 50% open space requirement, the lot sizes are down to, I guess, 20% of what they might otherwise be based on sort of the soil types. So I think it can work, Daryl. But I think, again, my goal here was to respond to the commission's original conversation about all we're getting is the unbuildable land. And so just to expose the commission to, again, the proportionality thing, and we should talk about that and refine it.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Matt, I would suggest that if you do have additional thoughts, share them with us, because if there's additional material that you would like to have or the commission would like to have for a future working meeting, you sharing it now so that I get a chance to start putting that information together would be helpful for me.
Okay, so I'll make this quick. It's 6731.
Yep.
What is the idea behind the minimum, the word minimum here? Is
Somebody
minimum-
could certainly give us more. In other words, if somebody wants to give us 45% open space in the VR1, they can certainly do that. This is not you have to hit that number exactly. I think what we're meaning here, you have to give us at least that number.
But can the commission require? And
No.
I think that's the question. Can the commission, is there any way that we can, us or future members of this commission, interpret this to say that the minimum is 40% in the VR1 and VR2 and 50% in the RU1, but minimum means that we can add to that. So for this particular application, we're going to say it's 70%.
No, I don't, I feel strongly that that should not be a requirement, that we state what we want, that we don't have the flexibility to change it. That's not fair.
I think I would urge considerable caution on that, Matt. I mean, I think due process with the regulations and protection of property rights would indicate that we have the ability to regulate development and how it happens at what density. But I think the situation, if I was to go ahead and buy a piece of property on the understanding that I'm going to do a conservation development and give you 50% open space and I'm going to put houses on the rest, and as part of my application, I come in and now you've changed the numbers to 80%, reducing the number of houses I can get. You start getting into the realm of what's called a regulatory taking of property. And I think that that's very delicate. I think the commission is further ahead by establishing a minimum and then perhaps even maybe some incentives for either more open space or better design and other situations like that. But I think the idea would be and even in our current subdivision regulations, we say the commission may require open space up to 15%. So it doesn't even actually require it in a conventional subdivision unless the commission says that it is. And that's the conversation we had on Carter Road. So I think you have to establish a regulation, and you might provide some flexibility to that. But I think if you start increasing the number because for whatever reason, I think it's a very sensitive area. And I would urge extreme caution.
And I absolutely agree. I feel as strongly as Wes seems to feel that there should be a set amount. And that's why I'm wondering whether the word minimum shouldn't be eliminated from this, that the open space shall be. And then we change with the language that we proposed for the April 20 meeting, a greater percentage of open space may be provided. So maybe we get rid of minimum and then add a greater may be provided.
Yeah, so I think what could work here, Matt, is to take out minimum here. So take that out. Shall be at least as follows, right? So here at the end of the sentence, say at least as follows. And then I think we can put another line down here below, which says additional open space may be provided.
Glenn, is that 40%? 40% of buildable, correct?
It's 40% of the entire property is the minimum that has to be given.
I
And when
don't
we get,
agree with
hang,
that.
hang on a sec, Alice, hang on. I know you feel strongly about this, but second says is that 40% that you're required to give us has to reflect the composition of the parcel as a whole. So it's going to be whatever the percentage of wetlands is on the parcel is going to be the percentage of wetlands on the open space. Whatever the percentages of steep slopes is going to be the same thing. So as a result, there may be situations or scenarios where people will give us more open space because they can't use it. We're going to get more than the 40%, but we're not requiring it. They're going to be giving it to us.
And Alice, I would point to.
That still doesn't guarantee, what's wrong with that word buildable? Why isn't it in there?
But go to, if, I'm sorry, Alice, but if you go to 6740, where Glenn is suggesting.
I'm
that there
looking
are
at it,
two-
yeah.
There are two calculations for the maximum number of lots. And so we're talking about the the percentage of set aside at 40%. But then we go on to say in 6740 number 1, in the VR1 and VR2, we're saying that it's a minimum lot size approach where we take number 1, we say the maximum number of lots the commission may approve shall be the lower of the following: A, and then B, which is subtract any areas designed as wetlands, watercourses, steep slopes, and 100-year floodplains, and any other area required to be set aside as open space, and then divide that by 5,000 or 15,000.
So, and Matt, you're correct. And I think paragraph A here is meant to say, mathematically, this is the maximum number of lots you could get on a parcel, right? Which is sort of unconstrained. And this is a reasonable approximation, I believe, of the maximum number of parcels you could get on a constrained parcel. Whichever of those two is lowest is your maximum number of lots. So that was the thought process here. I think Wes hit the nail on the head earlier. I think that I would like the commission to ponder this and to have the regulation to kind of think this through. The merger, I think it's pretty straightforward. We've taken the provisions which were sometimes replicated on each side and just put them all together to make it clear. And then I think there's a couple of new approaches in here. One of which is the minimum lot size approach in the VR1 district, the proportionality requirement in the open space district, but to kind of think that through a little bit to make sure you're comfortable with it.
So I think that's a great place to stop. I know we went a few minutes longer than Wes had hoped when he made his comments in the beginning 20 minutes ago. But I think that I certainly wanted to talk through those couple of things to make sure that we all understood what the thinking was. But I do believe that this will require some thought by the commissioners, and that we should have maybe the next special meeting the third Thursday in, what are we in, May
June.
now? June?
Yep.
To
Yep.
just have the meeting dedicated to this conservation subdivision. We come in fresh, we talk about it for an hour and a half, and then quit.
I think that's a great idea.
So then I would look for a motion then to table this until our next scheduled special meeting to review the zoning regulations.
So I'll make that motion to table conservation development discussions until the third Thursday in June, which is a special meeting.
I'll second that motion.
Great. Thanks, Karen. Oh, and thanks. So we've got a motion on the table and a second, and Annie dropped off, and I need to elevate Chris to voting status.
He left too.
No, Chris is here.
Oh.
So we've got a motion on the table and a second, and we've elevated, we've got our 7 voting members, and I would ask if there's any further discussion. And hearing none, I will call the vote. All those in favor, so signify by raising your hand and or saying aye. And that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And Alice, you eyeing? Okay, that's great. All right, that's all of us. Then motion carries. And I have to get you guys down on the other screen so I can get to the agenda. Sorry, hold please. I lost it. Okay, we're back. So that brings us to agenda item number 3B, which is the cannabis regulation discussion. And I would suggest that we table this to some future meeting as a new item that we'd like to explore, but not something that we need to chase down before we finalize these couple of things that we've got on our plate.
So moved.
And a second.
Second.
Thanks, Wes and Daryl. Then any discussion regarding the cannabis regulations? Which is, by the way, that the discussion of revolving around cannabis and sales and cultivation and manufacture was in the packet tonight. So you guys can all take a look at that. I'm sorry, you all can take a look at that and see what you think for when we discuss it in the future.
Matt, I just had one really simple question about that. We received an email letter, and I was just wondering who the person is that wrote to us. Was he from Norfolk Planning and Zoning, or I don't know who this person is, where this letter came from, why it's and who he is. Want to know who it is.
So the Norfolk suggestion came from Glenn based on a previous regulation that he had written, but the original email came from somebody that actually Glenn, I think, may be more familiar with than I am, Christopher Schalt.
Yeah.
He's a land use analyst, and I think what they're doing is they're gathering information from each town as to what's permitted. Glenn, you probably know more than I do about
Yeah,
that.
I'll jump in for a moment. Chris Shout is a legal analyst, if you will, with Robinson and Cole. He's also the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission in Norfolk, and I've done some work with them. He, as I understand it, is in the process of doing a seminar statewide about what communities have done with regard to cannabis regulations. So his contact to Ty was with regard to regulations. Ty and I had a conversation about the request and the fact that perhaps your regulations weren't as clear as that they could be with regard to this. State law that was passed with regard to recreational use of cannabis identifies 11 different categories of uses and activities which the state will grant licenses for, but the town has the ability to identify which ones it will or will not permit. So I think the concern that Ty and I discussed was the idea that maybe Kent's regulations are not as clear as they could be. And so I think a formal declaration from the commission is, yes, we'll allow this, or no, we won't allow that, or whatever. I think now avoids a scenario in the future where people will have questions or propose things that you didn't want to have happen, et cetera. So that's why I shared the information with Ty of what Norfolk adopted. They took fairly simple and straightforward approach. They said, you know, some of the stuff is just like a manufacturing business. They're just manufacturing a carefully regulated product. Or if it's a retail store, it's a retail store. And so, again, I provided that just for background information for the commission about what another community had done. And also because it had the 11 different categories listed. So I don't know that it works for Kent necessarily, but it certainly tells you what the 11 categories are, and you guys can figure it out from there.
Perfect.
I just wasn't sure who the person was, and now you've given me the credentials, so.
Okay, that brings up just one quick question is, do we need to address this? Would you recommend, Glenn, that we address this sooner rather than later, or can we take this in the normal course of business?
I don't think there's a huge rush, Matt. I think if we're doing the regulations right now, I think for the commission to throw it on our agenda for our next working session next month is fine. The commission members can become familiar with it, see Norfolk's approach. Some communities have said, no, we're not doing this at all. Nothing, nowhere, no how in our town. Other communities have said, yeah, medicinal is okay, but we're not doing the recreational. So it really becomes an issue sort of for local approach as to what you might consider or want to do. Some communities have already adopted regulations and are receiving permit applications, but the state's only given out so many for the entire state. So it may never come to Kent, or it may, I don't know. But I think something for you to ponder, and I think clarity in your regulations would always be a good thing.
Okay, great, thanks. So there's a motion on the table and seconded to table this discussion until sometime in the future. And if there's no more discussion, then I would call the vote. All those in favor, so signify by raising your hand and or saying aye. And that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, that's all 7 of us. So that motion carries. And before we adjourn, I would, again, like to welcome Shelby. Shelby, thanks for, being here and thanks for being willing to speak up right away. So we're thanks so much. Good to see you.
It's terrific. Welcome,
Oh,
Shelby.
great, thanks. Yes, important work, I understand. Okay.
Then
It's a lot of fun, Shelby.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps Shelby would like to make the motion to adjourn then.
Oh, there you go. The first motion.
All right.
Go for it, Shelby.
I'll just displacing Wes. I moved that the meeting be adjourned.
I'll second.
All right, great. Thanks you all. And we'll see you next time.
See you next month. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Be good, y'all.
Bye.